But for right now, we're going to welcome Dr. Victor Asal to talk about the impact of religion and the use of violence by non-state actors. Welcome.
First of all, I'd like to thank ICERM for inviting me. This has really been very interesting, and it's really a pleasure. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you during lunch. Also, I'll be presenting some academic work. If anybody wants any of my papers, feel free to shoot me an email. If you don't have my email, I can promise you that if you put my name into Google, I'm the top 100, unless you're searching in Arabic or in Hebrew, in which case I'll have some competition. But if you're searching in English, Victor Asal, that's me. So what we're going to be looking at here is looking at religion, ideology, and the choice of violence. And one of the important things, I think, to make is that religiosity does not always have the same impact. So some of the biggest opponents of Israel, for example, are ultra-Orthodox Jews, right? And some of the biggest supporters of Israel are ultra-Orthodox Jews. And so religiosity can go in different directions. And one of the questions we need to look at is why it goes in different directions and what impact religiosity might have on religion and peace. My two main areas of research, I look at political violence as one main area of research. My other main area of research is political discrimination. I've also done work on, a long time ago, also on peacebuilding. And so I'm very much interested in the idea of looking at how religiosity can affect peace as well. But we're going to start on religiosity and how that might affect choices of violence. Theoretically, the model that I use, some people come with like one thing explains everything, and I don't think one thing explains everything. I think that when we look at what explains what, the organizational environment that an organization is, and my focus is primarily organization, can have an impact. If you're an organization, the Soviet Union, your choices of what you can do and can't do are going to be different than if you're an organization in the United States or you're an organization in Nigeria. That organizational environment is going to have an impact. Capabilities, relations. I can't tell you how many people get jobs because they know people. Relations make all the difference in the world. If we have relations, we can do things that we couldn't do otherwise. Relations can get us into trouble. Anybody who's been a teenager knows that. Relations can be very beneficial. So that's a capability. Also, attributes. Regardless of how good I am as a basketball player, I am never going to be in the NBA, okay? And I think we all know why, okay? And so there is Bugsy Malone. I know there's one guy who made it in, but, you know, who was under 5'4", but he's very unusual, and I'm not that good a basketball player. So capabilities matter also. Organizational goals, and this is where religion and ideology come in. Your organizational goals can have an impact on what you want to do, how you want to do it. But the important thing to note is that organizational goals are not the end-all and be-all, that we have to take these other factors in, because sometimes you do things that really aren't a goal of yours. Remember back to college. Did anybody ever say, let's do this on a Saturday night? And it had never been a goal of yours, but you decided to do it anyway. And sometimes that was great, and sometimes that was a huge mistake. So organizational goals, all of these feed into behavior. And when we think about behavior, so I like to think of the movie Ender's Game is really bad, but the book Ender's Game is really good in my modest estimation. And one question is whether beliefs matter. And there's a general argument by many people that beliefs don't matter, that killing is hardwired into people. Okay, so Valentine, who's Ender's sister, says, human beings don't evolve brains in order to lie around on lakes. Killing's the first thing we learned and a good thing we did, or we'd be dead and the tigers would own the earth. So some people will argue what you believe and what you believe and what you doesn't matter, it's hardwired into us. And so this whole ideology discussion is a waste of time. On the other hand, we do know that some people have focused on religious ideology arguing, and the big religious ideology that's been focused on mostly in the last 12 years, okay, is Islam. Islam keeps coming up in the literature about there's something special about Islam. And my read of history tells me that that may be true at the moment, but it's certainly not true over time. Okay, so you mentioned the Crusades, right? There are cases of really tremendous acts of violence. So we could go from the Crusades to the pogroms to, again and again, various kinds of killing that have been done by all sorts of religious groups. And I study terrorist organizations, and if you want me to stand here and give you a list of Christian terrorist organizations, Jewish terrorist organizations, Hindu terrorist organizations, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I have actually got some polytheistic terrorist organizations also. So where is that connection to religion? And one of the things that we're going to separate out here is a relationship between killing and killing on purpose. So what does the Ten Commandments say about killing? It's not a rhetorical question. What does the Ten Commandments say about killing? It doesn't say thou shalt not kill. That's how it's translated into English. But that's not what it says. Okay, what is it? Did anybody know in the Hebrew? What does it say?
Thou shalt not murder.
It says, "Thou shalt not murder." Al tirtzach. Okay, now it's been translated into "Thou shalt not kill," but there's a huge difference between "Thou shalt not kill" and "Thou shalt not murder." Okay, and this is why you can find in religious texts all sorts of things. So if you go into the Talmud, and there's a passage in the Talmud which says, if somebody gets up in the morning to kill you, you should get up a little earlier than them and take care of the problem, okay? And that's a very different view of how to, and so we've heard a lot of Judeo-Christian talk of the Judeo-Christian. I like to think of the Abrahamic religions because there is a core identity that is shared between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But the way that core identity is interpreted is different, and more importantly, within each religion, it's interpreted differently. So you have Jewish interpretations that go in certain directions. You have Jewish interpretations that go in other directions. You have Islamic interpretations that go in certain directions. Sufi Islam would not be a big fan of bin Laden, right? There are different interpretations of how to think about this. And so one of the key issues here is all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. But if evil is happening, what should you do about it? Now, some people would say you should adopt nonviolence. Okay, and Gandhi was recommending nonviolence as a solution against Hitler. I have a sneaking suspicion that nonviolence would not have had a big impact on Hitler's behavior. Okay, there's actually an interesting science fiction short story by Harry Turtledove that relates to that if people are interested. There's a question of violence, and there's the question of unrestrained violence. And that's an important distinction. Okay, and in many of the Abrahamic attitudes, it's a huge distinction. The Ten Commandments say, don't say thou shalt not kill, they say thou shalt not murder. And there's a difference between killing and murdering. There's a difference between shooting somebody who has a gun who's trying to shoot you and shooting somebody who's 7 years old and doing it on purpose. And so the distinction that I'm making in my analysis is what makes people, does religious ideology have an impact on whether organizations are more likely to kill? And if they start deciding to kill, does it have an impact on whether they're more likely to kill civilians? Because it's not the same choice. Shooting a soldier is not the same thing as shooting a civilian. And one of the things we have to remember is that we talk often about religious ideology, and it's often framed in a very negative way. But these three guys were all very religious. Some would even argue fundamentalist in conception, okay? And I'm not sure the middle guy actually looks the way he's painted here, but, you know, that's his general interpretation. But all of them preached very strongly for nonviolence, okay? They all said, you know, well, there's some, but they all were basically going in the nonviolent direction. And they all achieved certain results. What else happened to them? Okay, they were all killed, okay? And so we have, it's very important to start any discussion of the relation of religion and violence with the understanding that there is a connection between religion and nonviolence. And this is something that is understudied, something I'm looking for funding for. But it's an important thing to remember when we look at the next material that we're going to look at, And it's important to remember that in the same way that we know that religious ideology can promote nonviolence, religious ideology can also promote violence. There is a really, really great website called, and I didn't create it, it's called the Brick Testament. And the Brick Testament is a warped website in the sense the guy makes lots and lots of money creating holiday books telling stories, mostly Christian stories, portraying people from the Bible in Lego. So the story of Christmas in Lego. But if you go to his website, you find out that he's making lots of money off of religious people buying books to give to their kids on Christmas, but he really is not a big fan of religion, because what he does on his website is he portrays everything in the Bible in Lego, including a lot of the nasty stuff, okay? Including a lot of his daughters and all this other stuff. It's all there, right? And so if we want to know about people in the Bible who are giving us indicators of how to treat everybody, depending on how you look at it, here's Lego Moshe, or Moses, or Musa, saying, the Hittites, the Gershites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, you put them all under the curse of destruction, show them no pity. Okay? And Joshua, if you've read the book of Joshua, certainly lives up to that in the book of Joshua. Okay? And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass with the edge of the sword. And if I wanted to, I could also show you the book of Revelations, and I mean, there's not a holy book that doesn't have a component that is here, okay? And the reason why I believe that when we're focusing on the impact of religion on the possibility of violence at the moment is directly related to possibly a person who claimed to be a religious leader who's had, I think, the biggest impact in the last 15 years of world history. Okay, and that's Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden is very clear in this pronouncement of war against America that he made in 1998, where he says to kill Americans and their allies, and be very, very clear here, both civil and military. So he's being explicit that we're not just killing soldiers, we're also killing civilians, and we should be killing civilians. Is an individual duty of every Muslim who is able in any country where there's possible until the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram Mosque in Mecca are freed from their grip, and until their army shattered and broken wings, departing from all lands of Islam and capable of threatening any Muslim. So on the one hand, we have this element in religious ideology and religious texts. On the other hand, we also have this and this. And so I am going to talk about two data sets that we've done some analysis on that shed light about why religion might have this impact and the actual empirical impact that religions have. And so one of the real questions is, why should religion make you willing to die? Because although suicide bombing was invented by the Tamil Tigers, who were about as secular as you could possibly get, suicide bombing really grew as a major strategy and tactic within the context of very religious organizations. So why are you willing to die? And more importantly, why are you willing to kill? And one of the key arguments here is Juergensmeyer's argument. There's a sociologist named Mark Juergensmeyer. And Juergensmeyer argues that if your audience is people, then you've got to take into account how people are going to see what you do. But if your audience is God, then all that really matters is how God sees what you do. And if God wants you to do something, you're going to do it. But the key element here, Juergensmeyer points to, is that extreme ideology of any type, but he focuses on religion, gives you the power of othering. Othering can place any conflict into what he calls a cosmic war. And a cosmic war is such that the enemy is evil. And if the enemy is evil, then you destroy evil. Okay. Now, I ask this question usually when I ask to my students, 3 or 4 raise their hands, and I get depressed and I realize how old I am. But I'll ask it here and see if you guys are older. How many people have seen the movie Aliens? Remember the movie Aliens? Yes? Okay, good. I feel better. Okay, in the movie Aliens, for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm sure you've heard about it, yes? Movie Aliens, Ripley, phenomenal actress. Ripley goes in, and she goes into a creche or a nursery of baby aliens. Lots of baby aliens going around. And Ripley goes into that nursery. Remember this scene? Yes? Those of you who saw the movie, do you remember the scene? And she firebombs the nursery of aliens. Okay? Does anybody remember this scene? Yes? And when I ask my student, yeah, and how did you feel about it? Did you feel morally compromised when you did? Because most people don't. Most people cheer. Because the aliens are evil. And so if you kill a baby alien, it's like killing a grown-up alien. They are inherently, completely, and totally evil. So if you can other someone so totally that they're not even really human, they're just evil, that's a tremendous power. Okay? For the Nazis, the undesirables are not human. Okay? And just remember, Nazis didn't only just kill the Jews, not only the gypsies, but they actually practiced most of their methodology on people with disabilities when they started, because they weren't really human. They weren't smart enough to be really human. It's okay. They othered them effectively. And Juergensmeyer argues that you can take the same religious texts that enable you to be a really good person and sacrifice yourself for the good of others, and use those texts to take somebody and say, that person is evil. And if that person is evil and their family is evil and everything about them is evil, what they deserve to do is to die. Because has anybody ever wondered when they're stepping on, and I know there are no cockroaches in the city of New York, but let's assume you're living someplace else. When you're stepping on a cockroach, do you really care whether it's a baby cockroach or a grown-up cockroach? Not even a little bit. That's othering. Do you see the argument here? Baby cockroach, grown-up cockroach, evil. Baby mouse, big mouse, dead. And so the logic here is that you can other people. And so what we're arguing is that if you have a supernatural audience and you have an ideology that can other people, ethnic ideology can also other people, right? For 400 years in the South, blacks weren't really human because they're not really human, right? They're different. And so that power of othering is not just religious. It can also be ethnic or racial in context. And so what we did, I did this with a colleague, Carl Rethmeyer. What we did was we created a data set called the BAD data set. And the BAD data set stands for it's big, allied, and dangerous. Carl did all the hard work, but I created the acronym so that I can say to a policymaker, do you want some bad data? And very few things have brought me as much pleasure as saying to a policymaker, you really need to look at this bad data. And so it's a lot of terrorist organizations that we've coded, and we coded all sorts of, what are their ideologies, how big they are, what are they networked to. And this is a network picture that shows the power of networks. The red organizations are Islamist organizations, blue organizations are different ideologies. But you can see just by looking at it that having a lot of network connections makes you more lethal, right? We talked about getting stuff through knowing people. It can make you more lethal. And there's some interesting connections here, but you can see if the size of the node is how lethal an organization is. Are you seeing that from 98 to 2007, Islamist organizations, which were the largest number of religious organizations in our data set, do you see that they seem to be more lethal than the other organizations? The size of the node is bigger, yes? Okay. So what we find when we do the analysis is that actually, if you really want an organization to be lethal and kill a lot of people, and by people I mean civilians, the best combination ideologically is if they're both ethno-nationalist and religious. And if you bring those two ideologies together, which have the capability of othering people, you get organizations that probabilistically, this is not deterministic, it's statistical analysis, probabilistically are much, much more lethal than other organizations. Religious ideology, though, has another component to it that actually is a backdoor towards lethality, which is religious organizations of the same religion are much more likely to have network ties with other religious organizations, more than ethno-nationalist organizations are likely to have ties with other ethno-nationalist organizations. So not only is there that power of othering happening here, but there's also that issue of network connections, okay? So we can take a look here, and this really isn't related, but it's funny, so I'm going to show you. So we have, here's the Islamic Great Eastern Raiders Front. They're a terrorist organization out in Central Asia. They're connected to the PKK, who hates the Turkish government because they're not Kurdish. They're connected to the DHKPC, which hates the Turkish government because this group is communist. They're connected to the International Solidarity Organization, which is an anarchy organization. They hate all governments, right? Nothing has made me happier in my life than the fact that the network structure of the anarchists is a pentagram, okay? Nothing. It's a pentagram. We didn't make it up. That's just how it showed up. And they're connected to ETA, which is an ethno-nationalist organization in Western Europe. And that shows you the power of networks, and you go from ethno-nationalists in Western Europe to Islamists in Central Asia. 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That's why when people tell me about profiling and the wonders of profiling based on how people look, I laugh at them, because if I want to get somebody through a security line, I don't need to find somebody that looks like who you think you're looking for, because it's this kind of network connection. A really good example of that is the Japanese Red Army that attacked the Israelis in the early 70s. The Israelis weren't thinking the Japanese were out to get them. They made a deal with the PFLP. Okay? It's a little bit of a side note, but I figured I'd say it. But one of the things that's really missing from this analysis is that we're looking at groups that have already chosen violence. And most religious organizations, frankly, most organizations in general, are not violent organizations. And so if we want to understand violence, one of the things that we should be doing is looking at what organizations will choose violence. To do that, you need a comparison of data of nonviolent organizations and violent organizations. I've gotten a lot of resources for collecting data on groups that have already done violence. It's much, much harder to collect data on groups that have not done violence. We do have one set of data that I'll be showing you in a moment. But the key question is not just killing people, it's killing civilians, which isn't the same thing. Okay? I don't know how many people here have been trained in the military, but it's one thing to train somebody to shoot people, shoot soldiers. It's very different to train somebody else or get somebody else to shoot civilians. It's a really hard thing to do. And Camus says, well, if you really want to understand the reasoning for it, I must condemn a terrorism operating blindly on the streets of Algiers and which one day might strike at my mother or my family. I believe in defending justice, but first I will defend my mother. This kind of gets at the reason why some people might start using unacceptable forms of violence if they believe it's the only way they can defend their mother or their child. Okay? So the MAROB data, or Minorities Risk Organizational Behavior data, and I am looking right now to try and expand this to a set of religious organizations, but what MAROB does is it has data on ethno-political organizations. These are organizations that claim to represent ethno-political organizations, minority ethno-political organizations, and our first set of data for this is in the Middle East. And what we're looking at is violence and terrorism as a strategy, a tactic, or an anomaly. So as a strategy, since 1994, Hamas is primarily focused on violence, but not just violence, but terrorism. That has to do with Baruch Goldstein and attack in the Hebron in Hebron at that time. The PKK has gone back and forth with violence against civilians, but primarily target the military. Hamas, before 1994, before the Baruch Goldstein attack, primarily attacked soldiers. And I want to be clear here, attacking soldiers doesn't mean that you're doing it nicely. One of Hamas's tactics was to kidnap soldiers, emasculate them, and let them bleed to death. Okay? But they were still focusing on soldiers, which is different than focusing on civilians. Okay? And so when we looked at factors, we looked at issues of ideology, issues of capability, issues of government behavior, and one of the things we found is that, and there are all sorts of other interesting findings here. By the way, for other analysis that I found, one of the things we found in the Middle East, if your organization is, and this is not in this analysis, but I'll mention it based on the ambassador's previous comments, if your organization is one that promotes gender equality, you are much less likely to use violence. Organizations that promote gender equality are much less likely to use violence. But what we see here is if we look at religious organizations, and this to me makes a lot of sense, the literature tells us that religious organizations are more likely to be violent. We are looking at this only in the Middle East, only for ethno-political organizations, so I have to caveat that and say if I want to do, give me money and I'll do it for a larger group, right? But for this set of groups in the Middle East, religious ideology does not make an organization more likely to use violence. It doesn't. And that's an important finding because an awful lot of people are telling us that it does, especially within the context of the Middle East. Now, what it does do, and this speaks directly to the issue that Juergensmeyer brings up, is if an organization decides to use violence, and it is a religious organization, it is more likely to attack civilians. So religious ideology does not make organizations more likely to start killing people. But if a religious organization starts killing people, it's more likely to target civilians, which gets back to that whole aliens and othering argument, because they can go back, if they've already made the choice of, the religious texts are not going to motivate them to start killing people. But once they start killing people, they can go to the religious texts for ideological justification for the othering of killing civilians. Okay? A couple of things. A, just the Middle East. B, just ethnopolitical. C, just minority groups. Okay, so we're still not talking about everybody. But A, it's not impacting the first choice of violence. And then also, a bigger caveat, and this sometimes gets lost in our whole conversation about killing people. We tend to focus on non-state actors. Guys, the big killers of the 20th century, and we're working on the 21st century, and we seem to be going in the same direction, okay, are governments. Governments kill lots and lots and lots of people. And one of the things to remember, this is a list of 20th century mortocracies. That's governments that have slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, millions. Please note that if we look at the really big killers of the 20th century, China, the USSR, let's skip colonialism for a second, Germany, and China, these are secular ideologies, not religious ideologies. And that's very important to remember in this whole discussion. Not only the element that governments need to be addressed also, okay, because the big killers can be governments, but also there's plenty of stuff out there where secular organizations and secular governments are killing lots and lots of people. And let me just go back to that. Religious ideology can also impact how governments behave in terms of killing people, okay? So there are governments out there, so we've done analysis, this is different analysis, on government behavior. But there are still, depending on the year, because this goes back and forth, there are still 7 to 12 governments in the world today that if they catch somebody in a homosexual relationship, the punishment for that person is death. And the key predictor of death penalty has nothing to do with the religious nature of the state. But the key predictor of whether the death penalty will be applied for homosexuality is, again, whether that government is a religious government, i.e. it has religious, and that doesn't mean all, right? But that is the best predictor for whether or not a government's going to apply that kind of punishment. Okay? Thank you, and I hope that wasn't too boring.